Michael Randall had always dreamed of a peaceful retreat where he could focus on his work and escape the chaos of city life. As a professional art restorer and craftsman, he spent years perfecting his skills, building a reputation for breathing life back into old treasures. When he stumbled upon a lakeside property on the outskirts of town, nestled between a lush forest and a quiet riverbank, he knew it was exactly what he had been looking for. The house wasn't perfect, it was old and in need of repairs, but that was part of its charm. It had character, and Michael was determined to bring it back to life, just like the antiques he so carefully restored. The property itself was tranquil, with the river winding along one side and tall, swaying trees creating a natural border of privacy. For Michael, it was more than a house, it was a sanctuary, a place where he could finally feel at home. The first few months after moving in were a blur of hard work and quiet satisfaction. Michael threw himself into renovations, fixing creaky floorboards, patching up the leaky roof, and turning one of the larger rooms into his dream workshop. This was where he planned to restore his clients' heirlooms and possibly work on some personal projects of his own. He loved the way the sunlight streamed through the windows in the morning, casting golden streaks across the room and illuminating the tools neatly arranged on his workbench. The nights were even more serene. He would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the gentle hum of crickets and the occasional splash of fish in the river. It was a stark contrast to his old life, where the constant noise of the city never seemed to let up. Here, he could finally breathe. One crisp autumn morning, Michael noticed something unusual. He had just returned from his weekly trip to the nearby farmer's market when he spotted a group of workers standing near the edge of his property. They were setting up what looked like markers and surveying equipment, talking amongst themselves as they pointed toward the river. Michael frowned. He hadn't authorized any work on his land, and as far as he knew, there weren't any public projects scheduled in the area. Curious and slightly concerned, he approached them. "Good morning," he called out as he crossed the yard. "Can I help you with something?" One of the men, a middle-aged worker with a clipboard, glanced up briefly before returning his attention to the equipment. "We're just doing some preliminary surveying," he replied, his tone curt. Michael raised an eyebrow. "Surveying for what? This is private property." The man hesitated for a moment, exchanging a look with his colleague. "It's for a community development project," he said finally. "We're authorized to be here." Michael felt his stomach tighten. Authorized by whom? The man didn't answer directly, instead handing Michael a folded piece of paper from his clipboard. Michael unfolded it and scanned the document. It was an official notice stating that the local council had approved a project to improve infrastructure in the area, specifically the construction of a new sewage treatment facility. The project, according to the document, would benefit the entire community by enhancing sanitation and environmental safety. What shocked Michael most was the highlighted section indicating that part of his property had been designated for the facility. "This must be a mistake," Michael said, his voice firm. "No one informed me about this, and I certainly didn't agree to it." The man shrugged. "You'll have to take it up with the council," he said, already turning back to his equipment. Frustrated and confused, Michael spent the rest of the day trying to contact someone in the council's office. Each call led him to a different department, none of which seemed to have concrete answers. Some claimed they had sent notifications months ago, while others insisted that it was all perfectly legal under local zoning laws. Michael dug through his mail, certain he hadn't received any such notice. He even checked with his neighbors, but they were just as unaware of the project as he was. It didn't make sense. How could something so major happen without his knowledge? By the end of the week, things took a turn for the worse. Early one morning, Michael was jolted awake by the rumble of heavy machinery. He looked out the window and saw bulldozers and excavators rolling onto his property, accompanied by more workers in reflective vests. Panic set in as he watched them unload materials and start digging near the riverbank. Throwing on a jacket, Michael rushed outside, waving his arms to get their attention. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of the machines. One of the supervisors approached him, clipboard in hand. "We're breaking ground for the treatment facility," he said matter-of-factly, as though this were an everyday occurrence. "This is my land," Michael snapped. You can't just start tearing it up without my permission." The supervisor looked unimpressed. "We have the necessary permits," he said, holding up a stack of papers, as if that explained everything. Michael felt a mix of anger and disbelief. "I don't care what papers you have, this is my home. You're damaging my property." But his protests fell on deaf ears. The workers continued their preparations, and Michael could do little more than stand there, helpless, as they staked out the area and marked spots for excavation. He could already see the damage they were causing: tire tracks tearing through his lawn, the once pristine riverbank marred by piles of dirt and debris. The air smelled of gasoline and churned earth, a harsh reminder of how quickly his sanctuary was being taken from him. That evening, Michael sat in his workshop, staring blankly at a half-finished restoration project. His hands trembled with frustration as he replayed the day's events in his mind. This wasn't just about a construction project, it was about losing the place he had worked so hard to build, the place he called home. He didn't know what his next move would be, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let them take his land without a fight. The following morning, Michael awoke to the sound of metal striking metal and the low rumble of machinery reverberating through the walls of his home. He hadn't slept well, his mind racing with questions about how the situation had spiraled out of control so quickly. As he stumbled to the window and looked out, his stomach sank. The workers hadn't stopped at staking out his land, they were now actively excavating, digging a massive trench that ran perilously close to the river. His lawn, once vibrant and lush, was now a churned-up mess of mud and tire tracks. Michael hurriedly threw on a jacket and stepped outside, hoping to reason with whoever was in charge. The scene before him was chaotic. Bulldozers were tearing through the earth, while workers shouted instructions to one another over the deafening noise of machinery. A cloud of dust hung in the air, turning the crisp morning light into a hazy gray. He spotted the same supervisor from the previous day, clipboard in hand, standing near one of the machines. "Hey," Michael called out, his voice barely audible over the commotion. When the supervisor didn't respond, Michael marched toward him, his frustration mounting. "Hey, stop this right now." The man turned, looking mildly annoyed. "We're on a tight schedule, sir," he said flatly. "What's the problem now?" "The problem," Michael said, his voice tight with anger, "is that you're tearing up my property without my consent. I didn't agree to any of this." The supervisor sighed, as if Michael's objections were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Like I told you yesterday, we have all the necessary permits. This project has been approved by the council and falls under public infrastructure development." "Public infrastructure," Michael repeated incredulously. "This is private land, my land. You're destroying it without my permission, and you're telling me I can't do anything about it." The man's expression remained impassive. "I suggest you take it up with the council, sir. We're just following orders." Michael felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. He wanted to scream, to demand that they pack up their equipment and leave, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. These workers didn't care about his land or his rights, they were just there to do a job. By the time the machines finally rumbled to a stop that evening, Michael's property looked unrecognizable. The once picturesque riverbank was now a jagged scar, the water muddy and churned from the excavation. He noticed that the trench they were digging appeared to be part of a larger structure, likely the foundation for the sewage treatment facility. The thought made his stomach turn. Determined to get answers, Michael spent the rest of the night drafting emails and making calls. He reached out to the council again, demanding an explanation and proof of the permits they claimed to have. Every response he received was either vague or dismissive. Some claimed that notices had been sent months ago, while others insisted that the project was entirely within legal bounds. Michael knew this couldn't be true. He had never received any such notice, and his neighbors hadn't either. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The next day, Michael decided to visit the council's office in person. He hoped that speaking to someone face-to-face would yield better results than the endless loop of phone calls and emails. When he arrived, he was directed to a small waiting area, where he sat for nearly an hour before a young clerk finally called him into an office. The clerk, a man in his mid-20s with an air of practiced indifference, barely looked up from his computer as Michael explained the situation. I need to see the permits for the construction on my property, Michael said, struggling to keep his voice steady. The clerk typed something into his computer, his fingers moving lazily across the keyboard. What's the address, he asked. Michael provided the information, and the clerk spent a few moments scrolling through the screen before nodding. Yep, it's all here, he said. The project was approved 6 months ago. Notices were sent out to all affected property owners. I didn't receive any notice, Michael said firmly. And I'm telling you, this construction is causing serious damage to my home. I need to know who signed off on this. The clerk sighed and leaned back in his chair. If you didn't get the notice, that's not really our problem, he said. The law allows for public infrastructure projects to use private land under certain conditions. Everything appears to be in order here. Michael's patience snapped. In order, he said, his voice rising. My land is being destroyed, my home is at risk, and you're telling me it's all in order. I want to speak to someone higher up. The clerk gave him a bored look. You can file an appeal if you want, he said, sliding a stack of forms across the desk. But I'll warn you, these things take time. Months, sometimes even years. By the time it's processed, the project will probably be finished. Michael stared at the forms in disbelief. It was clear that the system was designed to discourage people like him from fighting back. Furious and defeated, he left the office without another word. Back at home, the situation only grew worse. The construction work continued at a relentless pace, and the damage to his property became more severe with each passing day. Cracks began to form in the foundation of his house, and the once clear river now carried a murky, polluted sheen. Michael documented everything, taking photos and videos of the damage, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. He needed real legal help. That evening, as he sat in his workshop trying to figure out his next move, he noticed an unfamiliar car parked near the edge of his property. A man in a dark suit was standing next to it, talking on his phone and occasionally glancing toward Michael's house. Michael's heart sank. It was clear that the situation was escalating, and he had no idea what to expect next. Determined not to be intimidated, Michael called a local attorney the next morning. The attorney, a sharp and pragmatic woman named Claire, listened carefully as Michael explained the situation. She agreed to take on his case and promised to investigate the legality of the project. Over the next few days, Claire uncovered several alarming details. It turned out that the council had indeed approved the project, but there were discrepancies in the paperwork. The permits were incomplete, and the required environmental impact assessments had either been skipped or falsified. Even more troubling was the discovery that the construction company handling the project had ties to a prominent local politician, a man with a history of shady dealings. When Claire presented this information to Michael, it only confirmed what he had suspected all along. The project wasn't just careless, it was corrupt. But knowing the truth was only the first step. Now Michael had to figure out how to stop the construction before his home was completely destroyed. As he looked out at the chaos unfolding on his property, Michael felt a surge of determination. He didn't know how long the fight would take or how much it would cost, but he wasn't going to let them get away with this. His sanctuary might be in ruins, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Michael stood at the edge of his torn-up property, staring at the enormous trench that now stretched across what had once been his carefully maintained yard. It felt like the destruction was advancing daily, swallowing everything he had worked so hard to create. His frustration bubbled over as he watched the workers hammering stakes into the ground and unloading yet more heavy equipment. The noise was relentless: jackhammers, engines, shouting, and it made it impossible for him to think clearly. The cracks in his house's foundation were worsening. The walls in his workshop, the heart of his home, were beginning to show stress fractures, and he could feel the slight but steady tilt in the floor beneath his feet. It was only a matter of time before the damage became irreparable. He tried to talk to the workers yet again, but they brushed him off like an irritating fly, refusing to engage in any meaningful conversation. Their standard response was always the same: we're just following orders. Michael's attorney, Claire, had filed an official complaint, citing the discrepancies in the project's permits and the lack of proper environmental assessments. She also submitted a cease and desist letter to the construction company, but the response was predictably slow. The company's representatives argued that they were operating within the bounds of the law and claimed that halting the project would result in significant losses. It was clear to Michael that they weren't going to stop unless they were forced to. That evening, as Michael was documenting the damage to his property with a camera, he noticed something peculiar near the riverbank. One of the workers had left behind a bundle of documents in a plastic folder, abandoned on a stack of pallets. Curious, Michael waited until the workers had finished for the day and the site was quiet before carefully approaching the materials. He flipped through the papers, his heart pounding. Among the mundane project schedules and construction plans, there was a blueprint of the trench they were digging. It wasn't just a simple sewage pipe, as they had claimed. The design suggested something far more complex, a network of underground tanks and channels that seemed excessive for a basic treatment facility. Michael took photos of the documents before slipping them back into the folder and retreating to his house. That night he pored over the images, trying to make sense of what he had found. The scale of the construction didn't match what the council had described. Why would a project of this magnitude require such extensive infrastructure, and why was it being built so close to his home? The next day, Claire called with an update. She had been digging into the construction company's background and discovered that they had a history of questionable practices. Several of their previous projects had been linked to environmental damage, and in one case, they had been sued for deliberately exceeding their approved scope of work to cut costs. Worse, Claire uncovered that the company had received the contract without the usual public bidding process, raising serious questions about corruption. Armed with this information, Michael decided to escalate the situation. He contacted a local environmental advocacy group, hoping they would take an interest in the potential ecological harm the project was causing. The group sent a representative, a sharp-eyed woman named Beth, to survey the site. When Beth arrived, she was visibly shocked by the scale of the excavation. "This isn't just about your property," Beth said after walking the length of the trench. "This could have catastrophic effects on the river's ecosystem. They're destabilizing the bank and disrupting the natural flow of the water. If they don't stop soon, you're looking at a serious risk of flooding." Her words only confirmed Michael's worst fears. The environmental group agreed to help him file a separate complaint, focusing on the ecological damage caused by the construction. This gave Michael a small sense of hope, but it was short-lived. Later that evening, as he was reviewing his growing collection of photos and documents, he noticed headlights cutting through the darkness outside. A black SUV was parked at the edge of his property, and a man in a suit was standing next to it, speaking on his phone. Michael's unease deepened. The man didn't approach the house or make any attempt to speak to him. Instead, he lingered for a few minutes before driving off, leaving Michael with the unsettling feeling that he was being watched. The next morning, Michael woke to find a handwritten note taped to his front door. The note, scrawled in uneven handwriting, read, "Stop fighting this, or you'll regret it." There was no signature, no indication of who might have left it. Michael's stomach churned with a mix of anger and fear. Someone was trying to intimidate him, but he refused to back down. He took the note to Claire, who advised him to install security cameras around his property. "You need to protect yourself," she said firmly. Michael followed her advice, purchasing several cameras and positioning them to cover the most vulnerable areas, the perimeter of his property, the riverbank, and the front porch. He also began keeping a detailed log of every suspicious incident, from the SUV to the note. As the construction continued, Michael's sense of isolation grew. His neighbors, initially sympathetic, were becoming wary of getting involved. Many of them had their own concerns about the project but were reluctant to speak out, fearing retaliation. Michael couldn't blame them. He was beginning to feel the weight of the fight himself. One afternoon, as he was inspecting the cameras, Michael noticed something strange in the footage from the previous night. A figure dressed in dark clothing had been lurking near the riverbank, carrying what appeared to be a flashlight and a set of tools. The person had spent several minutes examining the construction site before disappearing into the woods. Michael couldn't tell if they were connected to the construction company or if they had another agenda entirely. The following day, Michael decided to confront the foreman at the construction site directly. "I know this project isn't what you're claiming it to be," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I've seen the blueprints, and I know you're doing more than just building a treatment facility." The foreman's expression hardened. "I don't know what you think you've figured out," he said, stepping closer to Michael, "but you're in over your head. If I were you, I'd let this go before it gets messy." Michael refused to be intimidated. "If you don't stop this now, I'll make sure everyone knows what's really going on here," he said. The foreman didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing alone in the middle of the construction site. As Michael headed back to his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was spiraling out of control. The threats were becoming more overt, and the damage to his property was getting worse with each passing day. That night, Michael sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by piles of documents, photos, and notes. He knew he couldn't keep fighting this battle alone. It was time to bring in more help, but he wasn't sure who he could trust. All he knew was that he couldn't let the construction continue. If he didn't act soon, there might not be anything left to save. The rain started early that morning, soft at first, but by the time Michael sat down with his coffee, it had turned into a relentless downpour. The trench on his property was now filling with water, small streams carving paths through the mud and pooling at the edges of his lawn. The river itself looked angrier than usual, swollen and fast-moving, as though it, too, was rebelling against the chaos. Michael stared out the window at the devastation, his mind racing. Every day, it seemed, the situation became more dire, and the solutions felt further and further out of reach. The previous evening, Claire had called him with some alarming news. Her investigation into the construction company had uncovered yet another layer of corruption. While reviewing public records, she found evidence that the company had bypassed a critical environmental review by filing incomplete documents and claiming exemptions that didn't apply to this project. Worse, the permits they had presented to justify the work on Michael's property were riddled with inconsistencies, dates that didn't match up, signatures that didn't look authentic, and vague descriptions that left more questions than answers. It was becoming increasingly clear that the entire project had been rushed through approvals in a deliberate effort to avoid scrutiny. But uncovering the truth and stopping the construction were two entirely different things. Claire explained that while these findings strengthened their case, the legal system was slow, and the construction company was exploiting every loophole they could find to keep the project moving forward. "We need more than just paperwork to stop them," she had said. "We need public pressure, witnesses, and undeniable proof of the harm they're causing." Michael didn't know where to start. He had already contacted the environmental group, and while they were sympathetic, their efforts were tied up in bureaucracy. Beth, the group's representative, had filed an emergency complaint about the riverbank damage, but it would take weeks, if not months, for an official investigation to begin. Meanwhile, the destruction on Michael's property continued unchecked. The day after the rainstorm, Michael decided to inspect the damage up close. He put on a pair of rubber boots and a raincoat and stepped outside, his breath clouding in the chilly morning air. The trench was a disaster, waterlogged and unstable, with sections of the bank crumbling into the rushing current. Large puddles had formed across his yard, and the foundation of his house was now visibly compromised. He knelt down to take photos, documenting every crack and sagging section of the walls. As he moved closer to the trench, something caught his eye. Among the piles of construction debris and muddy tire tracks, there was a small metallic object glinting in the weak sunlight. Michael bent down and picked it up. It was a strange piece of equipment, small, sleek, and clearly high-tech. It didn't look like it belonged to the heavy machinery on the site. He turned it over in his hands, noticing a small engraved logo on the side. It was a symbol he didn't recognize, a geometric shape that looked almost like a stylized eye. Michael's curiosity deepened as he pocketed the device and continued his inspection. That evening, he emailed a photo of the object to Claire, asking if she could find out what it was. A few hours later, she called him back, her voice tinged with urgency. "Michael, this is serious. That symbol belongs to a private engineering firm that specializes in advanced surveillance technology. I don't know what one of their devices is doing on your property, but it's not supposed to be there." "Surveillance," Michael said, a chill running down his spine. "You're saying someone's been watching me?" I don't know for sure, Claire replied. But if that's their equipment, it raises some major questions. This company doesn't just sell cameras, they build systems for monitoring large-scale operations, and they're known for working with government agencies and private contractors. If they're involved in this project, it's bigger than just a sewage facility. The implications were staggering. Michael had already suspected that the project was more than it seemed, but this new discovery added a layer of complexity he hadn't anticipated. Why would a construction company need surveillance equipment on his property? And what were they monitoring? Determined to get to the bottom of it, Michael decided to reach out to someone who might have answers. He contacted a friend from college, Aaron, who worked as a systems analyst for a tech company. When Michael described the device and sent him the photos, Aaron confirmed Claire's suspicions. This isn't standard construction equipment, Aaron said during a late-night call. It's part of a modular system for tracking activity and real-time movement, sound, even environmental changes. Whoever put this there is collecting a lot more data than they're letting on. Michael felt a wave of unease wash over him. The device wasn't just monitoring the construction site, it was monitoring him. Aaron offered to analyze the device further if Michael could get his hands on more components, but Michael hesitated. He didn't want to escalate the situation without understanding what he was dealing with. The next day, Michael's unease turned into outright fear. When he checked his mail, he found another note, this one far more threatening than the last. Written in bold, blocky letters, it read, "You can T-win. Back off now." There was no envelope, no signature, just the stark message on a single sheet of paper. Michael took the note to Claire, who urged him to report it to the police. He was reluctant. His previous interactions with law enforcement had been frustrating and fruitless. But Claire insisted, arguing that the threats were escalating and needed to be documented. Reluctantly, Michael filed a report, though he doubted it would lead to any action. That evening, Michael sat at his kitchen table, staring at the growing pile of evidence he had collected: photos, documents, notes, and now the surveillance device. His property had become a battlefield, and he felt like he was fighting a war on multiple fronts against the construction company, the council, and now whoever was behind the surveillance. The weight of it all was crushing, but he refused to give up. In the days that followed, Michael began noticing other strange occurrences. At night, he heard noises outside: footsteps, whispers, the sound of something being dragged through the mud. When he checked his security cameras, he found that some of the footage had been corrupted, the images distorted with static. Someone was tampering with his system. Claire suggested hiring a private investigator to look into the situation, and Michael agreed. The investigator, a no-nonsense man named Tom, wasted no time digging into the project's backers and the companies involved. What he found only deepened the mystery. The construction company, it turned out, had connections to the same engineering firm that produced the surveillance device. The firm was listed as a subcontractor on several projects, but their role was always vague, described in terms like logistical support or data analysis. Meanwhile, Beth and the environmental group finally managed to get the local water authority to inspect the riverbank. The inspectors were horrified by the extent of the damage, declaring the site a potential hazard. Their preliminary report stated that if the trench collapsed further, it could trigger a landslide or severe flooding. This gave Michael a glimmer of hope. At least now there was official recognition of the harm being done. But as the pressure on the construction company increased, so did the intimidation tactics. One night, Michael returned home to find his porch light smashed and the front door slightly ajar. Nothing appeared to be stolen, but it was clear that someone had been inside. It was a message, loud and clear: "Stop fighting." Michael didn't sleep that night. He stayed up, staring out the window at the trench, the river, and the dark woods beyond. The fight was far from over, but he was running out of time. If he didn't act soon, he feared there would be nothing left to save. The days that followed felt like a waking nightmare for Michael. The escalation of threats and the sheer scale of destruction on his property had pushed him to his limits. The trench near the river had expanded further, and the noise of the construction had become a constant presence, grinding away at his patience and sanity. The cracks in his home's foundation now spread like spiderwebs, and with every passing day, the damage to his house became harder to ignore. Yet the contractors seemed completely indifferent. as though they had already written him off as collateral damage. Claire was doing everything she could on the legal front, but the wheels of justice moved painfully slow. She'd filed an injunction to stop the construction, but the construction company's lawyers had countered with endless paperwork, delaying the process further. To make matters worse, Claire discovered that the company was actively lobbying to retroactively legalize their work through an emergency motion with the local council, claiming that halting the project would lead to significant public health risks. It was a dirty tactic, but an effective one, and Michael feared they might succeed. In the meantime, Tom, the private investigator, was uncovering more unsettling details about the players involved in the project. The construction company was deeply entangled with a network of shell corporations, making it nearly impossible to trace who was really funding the work. However, one name stood out: a prominent real estate developer with a reputation for acquiring undervalued properties through aggressive and often questionable means. According to Tom, this developer had recently been purchasing land throughout the area, turning it into lucrative commercial sites. Michael's land, with its prime location by the river, was clearly part of a larger plan. The realization that his property had been targeted long before the first bulldozer arrived filled Michael with a deep, simmering rage. This wasn't just negligence or bureaucratic oversight, this was a calculated attack. The construction company, the council, and whoever was backing them had no intention of stopping, and every delay worked in their favor. One evening, as Michael sat in his workshop trying to organize his thoughts, he heard a loud crash outside. He rushed to the window and saw that one of the construction vehicles had plowed into the fence at the edge of his property. The driver, clearly unfazed, climbed out of the vehicle and gestured dismissively to one of his coworkers. Michael stormed outside, shouting at the workers to leave his property, but they barely acknowledged him. Instead, the foreman appeared and handed Michael yet another notice, this one accusing him of interfering with a lawful project and threatening legal action if he continued to obstruct progress. Michael's hands shook as he crumpled the paper. "You're the ones breaking the law," he yelled, his voice echoing over the sounds of machinery. "You're destroying my home, and you think I'm just going to stand here and let it happen." The foreman smirked, clearly enjoying Michael's frustration. "This is bigger than you, pal," he said. "You can make all the noise you want, but it won't change anything. This project is happening whether you like it or not." Michael clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. He knew that losing his temper would only make things worse, but the sheer arrogance of the foreman's words made his blood boil. He turned and walked back to the house, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Later that night, Michael received a call from Beth, the environmental advocate who had been helping him document the damage to the river. She sounded excited, almost breathless. "We've got something big," she said. "The Water Authority just completed a preliminary assessment, and they're recommending an immediate halt to all construction. The trench is dangerously close to destabilizing the riverbank, and they're saying it could lead to severe flooding." Michael felt a flicker of hope. If the Water Authority stepped in, it could force the construction to stop, at least temporarily. Beth promised to send him a copy of the report, which he could use to strengthen Claire's case. But even as Michael hung up the phone, a sense of unease settled over him. He'd learned by now that every small victory came with a backlash, and he didn't have to wait long to see it. The very next day, Michael found his front yard littered with debris, shattered glass, broken cinder blocks, and even scraps of metal. It was as if someone had deliberately dumped construction waste on his property. When he checked the security footage, he saw a group of workers casually tossing the debris over the fence in the middle of the night. Furious, Michael called the police, but when they arrived, the officers shrugged off the incident, claiming it was a civil matter and outside their jurisdiction. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. His neighbors, who had initially expressed sympathy, were now keeping their distance. Some even seemed annoyed with him, blaming his legal battles for the increased noise and disruption in the area. One neighbor told him bluntly, maybe if you just let them finish, they'd leave sooner. It was clear that the construction company's strategy of intimidation and division was working. Michael knew he couldn't rely on the police or his neighbors for support, so he focused on building his case. He spent hours combing through the Water Authority's report, highlighting every mention of environmental violations and safety hazards. He also continued documenting the damage to his property, taking photos and videos of the ever-widening cracks in his walls and the rising water levels near the river. But the construction company wasn't backing down. That week, they brought in additional equipment, including a massive pile driver that sent vibrations rippling through the ground with every strike. The tremors were so strong that Michael's shelves rattled and several of his tools fell to the floor. When he went outside to confront the workers, they ignored him completely, their faces blank and unresponsive. It was as if they were robots, programmed to carry out their tasks no matter what. Claire, sensing that they were running out of time, decided to take a more aggressive approach. She filed an emergency motion with the court, demanding an immediate injunction to stop the construction based on the Water Authority's findings. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Claire warned Michael that the outcome would be critical. "If we lose this," she said, "they'll have free rein to finish the project before we can do anything else." As the hearing date approached, Michael found it increasingly difficult to focus. The constant noise, the mounting threats, and the ever-present damage to his home were taking a toll on his mental and physical health. He barely slept, spending most nights pacing his workshop or staring out the window at the construction site. He felt like he was on the brink of losing everything: his home, his sanity, and his faith in the system. But despite the fear and exhaustion, Michael refused to give up. He knew that if he didn't fight back, no one else would. The construction company might have resources and connections, but they didn't have the right to destroy his life for their own profit. With Claire and Beth by his side, he prepared for the battle ahead, determined to make them pay for what they had done. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the hearing, a tense energy hanging in the air as Michael and Claire took their seats. Across the aisle sat the construction company's legal team, an intimidating group of suited men and women armed with binders full of documents and an air of smug confidence. At the center of it all was their lead attorney, a sharp-tongued man who had already tried to have the case dismissed twice before the hearing even began. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, Claire wasted no time laying out the case against the construction company. She started with the environmental report, citing the extensive damage to the riverbank and the risks of flooding. The report, she explained, wasn't just a recommendation, it was a warning that the project was endangering the entire area, including neighboring properties. She presented photos of the trench, the erosion along the river, and the cracks in Michael's home, all meticulously documented over the past weeks. "This isn't a matter of simple inconvenience," Claire said firmly. "This is an issue of public safety. My client's home is being destroyed, his land rendered uninhabitable. And the construction company's negligence threatens to destabilize the surrounding area. We're asking for an immediate injunction to halt all construction until a full investigation can be conducted." The lead attorney for the construction company rose to counter. He was smooth and polished, his voice dripping with feigned concern. He argued that the project was a necessary public works initiative and accused Michael of being overly emotional and resistant to progress. "This project is for the benefit of the community," he said, gesturing toward the gallery as if appealing to an imaginary crowd of supporters. "The opposition here is based on personal grievances, not on legitimate legal grounds." Claire didn't flinch. When her turn came to respond, she presented the discrepancies in the project's permits, pointing out the missing environmental impact assessment and the suspiciously altered zoning documents. She also highlighted the construction company's history of cutting corners on other projects, providing evidence of previous lawsuits and fines for similar violations. The turning point came when Beth, the environmental advocate, took the stand as a witness. She spoke passionately about the damage to the river and the long-term consequences of allowing the project to continue unchecked. Her testimony was backed by the Water Authority's findings, which she presented with the precision of someone who had spent years fighting these kinds of battles. The judge listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes as Beth described the irreparable harm the trench was causing. When it was Michael's turn to testify, he felt a lump rise in his throat as he took the stand. He wasn't used to speaking in front of crowds, let alone in such a formal setting, but the stakes were too high for him to falter. He described the impact the construction had on his home, his property, and his life, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. He told the court about the threats he'd received, the damage to his house, and the sleepless nights spent listening to the relentless noise of machinery. "This isn't just about my home," Michael said, his voice tightening with emotion. "It's about the blatant disregard for the rules, for the environment, and for the people who are supposed to be protected by those rules. If they can do this to me, they can do it to anyone." The courtroom fell silent for a moment as his words hung in the air. Even the construction company's legal team seemed momentarily thrown off balance. The lead attorney attempted to discredit Michael, suggesting that he was exaggerating the extent of the damage and implying that his opposition to the project was motivated by selfishness. But Claire was ready for this. She produced a recent letter from the construction company, a thinly veiled threat demanding that Michael drop his complaints or face legal repercussions. The letter, combined with the surveillance device Michael had found on his property, painted a clear picture of intimidation and underhanded tactics. The judge appeared increasingly unimpressed with the construction company's arguments. When Claire presented a final piece of evidence, a timeline showing how the company had rushed through the approval process, bypassing critical legal steps, the room seemed to shift. The construction company's lead attorney tried to spin the timeline as efficiency in the public interest, but the judge wasn't buying it. After several hours of testimony and deliberation, the judge finally spoke. "This court cannot ignore the overwhelming evidence of negligence, misconduct, and potential harm presented today," he said, his voice firm. "The construction on Mr. Randall's property and the surrounding area is hereby ordered to cease immediately. Furthermore, I am directing that an independent investigation be conducted into the permitting process for this project. Until such an investigation is complete, no further work may proceed." Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him as the judge's words sank in. The construction company's legal team looked visibly shaken, their carefully crafted arguments crumbling under the weight of the evidence. Claire leaned over and whispered, "We did it, Michael." But even as the initial relief set in, Michael knew the fight wasn't over. The construction company would likely appeal the decision, and there was still the matter of repairing the damage already done to his property. The independent investigation might uncover more corruption, but it would take time Michael wasn't sure his house or land had. As the courtroom emptied out, Michael stood for a moment, watching the construction company's team shuffle out with their heads low. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a crucial step forward. For the first time in weeks, Michael felt like he could breathe again. He turned to Claire, who was already making plans for the next phase of their fight. There was still a long road ahead, but for now they had won a critical battle, and for Michael, that was enough. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity, but for the first time in months, Michael felt like he could begin to rebuild both his home and his sense of peace. The court's decision to halt construction had sent shockwaves through the community, and the subsequent investigation revealed what Michael had suspected all along: the entire project had been a sham, designed to benefit a network of corrupt officials and developers. The construction company, along with several key figures in the council, was found to have falsified documents, bypassed critical environmental reviews, and used intimidation tactics to silence opposition. The scandal became the subject of heated public debate, with local media digging deeper into the corruption that had allowed the project to move forward unchecked. For Michael, it was bittersweet validation. Everything he'd endured, the threats, the destruction, the sleepless nights, had been for a reason, but it had come at a heavy cost. The riverbank was still a mess, and Michael's property was scarred from weeks of relentless construction. The trench remained, a gaping wound in the land, and the foundation of his home was so damaged that repairing it would require significant work. The compensation awarded by the court was substantial enough to cover the costs of rebuilding, and then some, but no amount of money could undo the emotional toll of the ordeal. Michael worked closely with Claire and Beth in the weeks following the ruling, not just to repair his own property but to ensure that something like this could never happen again. The environmental group pushed for stricter regulations on construction near waterways, and Michael found himself unexpectedly thrust into the role of an advocate. His quiet life by the river had been shattered, but it had also given him a purpose he hadn't realized he needed. As contractors arrived to begin the long process of restoring his home, Michael made it clear that he wanted the work done carefully and respectfully. He couldn't bear the thought of more damage to the land, even if it was in the name of repairs. Every nail hammered into place, every brick laid, felt like a small step toward reclaiming what had been taken from him. The neighbors who had once avoided him began to approach cautiously, offering quiet apologies and small gestures of support. Some brought food or supplies, while others simply stopped by to say they were sorry for not standing by him sooner. Michael accepted their kindness with quiet grace, understanding that fear had driven their silence. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the river, Michael stood at the edge of his property and watched the water flow. The trench had been filled, the land graded back to its natural slope, and the trees that had been uprooted were being replaced with new saplings. It wasn't the same as before, but it was a start. He held a small jar of river water in his hand, a token he'd kept to remind himself of what he was fighting for. The rebuilt foundation of his home was stronger than ever, both literally and figuratively. The repairs to his house had become a metaphor for the repairs in his life, a slow but steady process of putting the pieces back together. The scars on the land, like the scars on his heart, would fade with time, but they would always be a reminder of what he had endured and what he had overcome. Michael's workshop, the heart of his home, was the last thing to be fully restored. He spent hours arranging his tools, restoring the light fixtures, and carefully unpacking the projects he had put aside during the chaos. When he finally stepped back and turned on the lights, the room glowed warmly, as if it had been waiting for him to return. In the end, Michael wasn't the same man who had moved into the house months earlier. The fight had changed him, made him stronger, more determined, and less willing to back down in the face of injustice. He had gone to war for his home, and though it had cost him dearly, he had emerged victorious. As he sat on his porch that night, listening to the soft rustle of the trees and the gentle flow of the river, Michael felt a quiet sense of peace. His sanctuary had been tested, but it had endured, and so had he.